Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together.
Welcome back, everybody, to GenX Classic Sports. I'm your host, Sean Enos, and today I'm stretching my own rules just a little bit because this podcast, as you know, is all about sports history from the Gen X generation. And this event is definitely older than I am, but if you know anything about the way we name these generations, Gen X started in 1965. That means everybody born in 1965 is the beginning of Gen X, and it lasts until the people born in 1980. So even though I spent a lot of time advertising the 80s and the 90s and the 70s on here, we're going to stretch that back to 1965 in tribute to the birth of Gen X, and we're going to talk about, also in tribute to the Super Bowl, we're going to talk about the 1965 NFL championship game. That's right, I said the NFL championship game because this is pre-Super Bowl, obviously. Green Bay Packers and the Cleveland Browns. I spent a lot of time researching this one, so let's learn a little bit about the NFL in the season of 1965. Now, as usual, keep in mind the calendar flips over. So the regular season was 1965, but the calendar flips, and then this game happened in 1966, as we'll get to. So picture Green Bay before the Ice Bowl, before Super Bowls, before football even became such a billion-dollar experience that we all know now with the domes and drones and artificial grass and fantasy football and all of that. Before all of that, there was January the 2nd, 1966, the 1965/1966 NFL championship game, the 33rd NFL championship. A gray afternoon in Lambeau Field. Are there any other kind at Lambeau in, December and January? I don't know. Gray seems to be appropriate. A gray afternoon in Lambeau Field, 50,852 fans in the stands. Cold, muddy, heavy frosty air, no frills, no fireworks, just men in their mud-caked uniforms, their frosty breath, and they're playing for something that still felt personal back then. On CBS TV, we had a broadcast with Ray Scott, or is that Roy Scott? I am sorry, I cannot read my own writing. It's either Ray or Roy Scott. Ken Coleman and Frank Gifford calling the game, which, speaking of the game on television, it earned a 30.5 share, which means, I think, if I'm remembering how Nielsen ratings work, that means that 30% of the TVs that were turned on at that time were watching this game, and that's a big rating. Ticket prices were $10 and $12 for this game. And so, yeah, this was the 1965 NFL championship game, the Green Bay Packers and the Cleveland Browns. Let's get into it. On one sideline, you know who's over there, Vince Lombardi, coaching at that time what many consider, of course, to be the greatest dynasty in NFL history, all that stuff from the early 60s Packers and mid-60s Packers. On the other hand, and I've never heard of this coach's name, and I think I'm a decent NFL historian, but this one escaped me. So this coach was Blanton Collier, a calm, they say engineer-minded like presence guiding the Browns. Of course, after the departure and death of the legendary Paul Brown, this wasn't just a championship game. This was, even back then, this was what the journalists called a collision of eras. In other words, the old NFL versus the new NFL. Power versus precision, and a dynasty trying to hang on as a dynasty and a challenger trying to rise up and prove that throne was no longer safe. Here we go. Let's set the stage for you to fully understand what was happening in 1965. You have to understand the NFL. This was the first NFL championship game played in January, and it was the first to be televised in color. How cool is that, right? And it was the last NFL championship game before the Super Bowl. This was a two-league world back then, okay? It was still, the AFL over there existed, but the NFL was the league. This was pre-merger, so there was no Super Bowl yet. That would be January of 67. The NFL championship game was decided the champion between what was the Premier League, the NFL. And so this was the Super Bowl before the Super Bowl, and it meant everything to those NFL teams, obviously. The league had just expanded television coverage to be a national game. And anytime you talk about the NFL or any other sport, you have to talk about how television was covering it, whether it was a regional or more of a national thing. And this was the first time the NFL had really expanded to national coverage. But, man, the game in 1965, you've seen the pictures. It was still brutal, terribly physical, and a conservative game. And when you hear about conservative football, that typically means run the ball and tackle well, don't throw the ball. This was pre-shotgun formations. This was pre-spread offenses. This was no sideline technology. This is, never seeing 4 and 5 receivers. This was run the ball, control the clock, and survive and play defense, right? So that's what you're looking at when these two teams squared off against each other the first week of 1966. Occasionally, I try to throw a little trivia out here for all of us to learn something new, and here's a good trivia thing that I did not know. The NFL still had a consolation game back then. They called it the Playoff Bowl, believe it or not, and this was a game, and if you didn't make the NFL title game, which would have been the top two teams that went through the postseason, the third and fourth teams, which would have been the losers in the previous round, they played each other in the consolation game known as the Playoff Bowl. Well, guess what? In spite of the Green Bay Packers being the powerhouse that they were, they had a couple of hiccups in 1963 and in 1964. They played in that playoff bowl, not in the championship game. So the Packers in 1965 were 10 wins, 3 losses, 1 tie in the regular season. And since they had played in the playoff bowl in 63 and 64, they had not been champions of the NFL since their back-to-back wins in 1961 and 1962. Let me back up. So the Packers, 1961 and 1962, repeat champions. 1963 and 1964, repeat participants in the playoff bowl, not the NFL championship game. So, of course, the Packers were led by the great Bart Starr at quarterback, Jim Taylor and Paul Hornung in the backfield, and some guys you've heard of probably on the rest of the team: Jerry Kramer, Forrest Gregg, Fuzzy Thurston. On defense, you had guys like Herb Adderley, Ray Nitschke, and Willie Davis. I just found a great picture of Ray Nitschke the other day on something social media after a game. He's standing at his locker, bald head. He's got a cigarette in one hand and a Pabst Blue Ribbon cup in the other hand that I assume actually contains Pabst Blue Ribbon, and he's smoking at his locker without a shirt on. Interesting. Love Ray Nitschke. And then overseeing, of course, the team in the dynasty was Vince Lombardi. And by 1965, Lombardi was already a legend, of course, because they'd won 3 NFL titles in about 5 years. You've heard of the Lombardi sweep. You've seen the video probably where Lombardi has the chalkboard on the field in front of a fully dressed team, showing them exactly how man per man they're going to block the Lombardi Green Bay Packers sweep play. The fedora and the overcoats, the speeches, all that. This team, the Packers back then, they didn't expect to win. They believed really that it was more or less their birthright to win. And they came into this game as the NFL Western Conference champions. On the other side, the Cleveland Browns came into this game with 11 wins and 3 losses as the Eastern Conference champions. They were the reigning 1964 NFL champions, having destroyed Baltimore that year. So, hey, they're trying to repeat. Their quarterback was Frank Ryan, who was smart, unflashy kind of guy, but, there wasn't a whole lot of passing back then anyway. And, of course, Cleveland Browns were led by Jim Brown, the most dominant player back then, and very likely the most dominant player in football history. Wide receivers named Gary Collins and, of course, Paul Warfield. And for a kicker, the Cleveland Browns had Lou the Toe Groza, who's a kicker I've been reading about my whole life. He was 41 years old going to this game, but Lou the Toe Groza. So their defense, Cleveland, they were fast, they were disciplined, very opportunistic, meaning they forced turnovers and tended to score or give the offense a chance to score off turnovers. And like I said, Blanton Collier was considered very cerebral. He was like a college professor type. He had stepped into Paul Brown's shadow and somehow kept the train rolling. And so the Browns, they weren't necessarily the aggressive, tough type. They were precise, okay? And they believed that Green Bay could be beat for sure. Lambeau Field was around 26 degrees that day. Obviously, with any wind chill, it was going to seem a lot colder. And the field wasn't frozen like it would be a year later in the Ice Bowl, but it did have a tarp over it the night before, shielding it from the snowstorm that had come through. But after removing the tarp, it's muddy, it's sloppy, it's uneven. You've seen pictures of old, muddy, cold football fields from the 60s, and you know what the uniforms look like 2 minutes after getting out there. Because of that mud, it rained. It actually rained during the game on and off, and it had some sprinkles of snow. But yes, it was muddy, and therefore, this was not really a passing game surface to be playing on. It just wasn't. It was more or less going to be a survival test between what happened on the line and the battle of turnovers, and both teams were well aware of that. So let's talk about this game. In the first quarter, both teams started out playing cautiously. They were both running the ball into stacked defensive fronts. Any passing tended to be short, and this was a field position battle. I mean, football was invented to be a field position game where if you can't get it done, you punt it to the other end and play defense, right? That's old school football, so that's what you're talking about. Now, for the first drive of the game in the first quarter, Green Bay, actually, in spite of me saying all that about mud works both ways in the passing game. The great thing about mud in the passing game is that the receivers know where they're going and the DBs do not. So you can occasionally, obviously, throw some long passes in the mud. And so Green Bay, Bart Starr hit Carroll Dale on a 47-yard touchdown with 11:08 left in the first quarter to give Green Bay a lead of 7-0. Like I said, the DBs don't know where you're going, so changing directions for them, especially backpedaling, a lot tougher. Cleveland, later in the first quarter, Gary Collins scored on a 17-yard touchdown pass from Frank Ryan. So here I am talking about mud, and there's 2 touchdowns by throwing the ball to start the game. All right, but listen to this. Lou Groza was a famous kicker, okay? And like I told you earlier, he was 41 years old, and this was Cleveland's first drive of the game. So they score on the 17-yard touchdown from Frank Ryan, and somehow Lou Groza, the PAT, failed. And it looks like that they fumbled the snap on the PAT, okay? And Groza ended up with the ball and attempted a pass. But the bottom line was they did not get the PAT. There was no 2-point conversions back then. So Green Bay led 7-6 after the failed PAT. All right, later, first quarter, Cleveland comes back with a field goal by Lou Groza for 24 yards. He's making up for the PAT miss at that point, and that left 5 minutes and 37 seconds left in the first quarter and gave Cleveland a 9-7 lead. So they've got the 6 points on the touchdown and the Lou Groza 24-yard field goal. Now, Jim Brown, the great Jim Brown, in the mud, he was taking much shorter and choppier steps than he normally would. Jim Brown would want to blast the ball into the middle because of his great size and take advantage of the size that he had on a field like this. But Green Bay clogged the middle. That was their whole defensive strategy, was to clog the middle. So they made this major effort to keep the middle clogged up against Brown, which forced him outside. And that forced him to take much choppier, shorter strides. and it allowed the Green Bay defense to run him down a lot easier than they ever would have run down Jim Brown on a dry field. So that's how they were keeping it close early on against the great Jim Brown. So as I said, the first quarter ended with Cleveland and a 9-7 lead. In the second quarter, after the Packers drove most of that muddy field and were doing a good job of mixing up their plays between running and passing, they still had to settle in the second quarter for a 15-yard field goal. Man, that's a short field goal. Had to settle for a 15-yard field goal, and that was with 13 minutes and 20 seconds to go in the second quarter, and that gave Green Bay a 10-9 lead, and Don Chandler was the kicker for that. So Green Bay leading 10-9 on the field goal. Later, Cleveland got the ball back and was driving, but Willie Wood from Green Bay got the interception and took it all the way down to the 9-yard line. But Cleveland's defense really stiffened, and they held Green Bay to just a 23-yard field goal, once again by Don Chandler. So with 5 minutes and 30 seconds left in the second quarter, Green Bay was leading 13-9 thanks to their touchdown and 2 field goals. Cleveland needed to answer, right? Cleveland engineered a drive from their own 16, but ended up punting deep into Green Bay territory. On third down, Bart Starr, he overthrew Paul Hornung, and the ball was intercepted by Cleveland. Frank Ryan, the quarterback for Cleveland, moved Cleveland enough to finally get a 28-yard field goal out of Groza, and that made it 13-12, Green Bay at the half. So with the 13-12 lead at the half, Green Bay, according to legend, in the Packers locker room, Lombardi was furious, but he was also focused, okay? He didn't scream. He just challenged his team. According to history, he challenged his team to remember who they are, that it was their NFL. They run the show around here. So he basically gave them the old argument that you're better than this, you've worked too hard for this, and you're not losing this game. And this was psychological on his part, of course, because sometimes coaches will tell you they do that. They do have to occasionally, when things aren't going exactly their way, they might need to remind their team of who they are. So the Packers came out knowing they had to do better. So here's how the third quarter unfolded. Remember, it's 13-12 Green Bay starting the second half. The weather started getting worse, though, coming out after the halftime. Green Bay asserted a lot more dominance in the snow, taking advantage of the physical aspect of their play. There was mud, there was fog, and when that happens, there's a lot more conservative play calling, which honestly led into the battle on the ground that you would think Jim Brown would have the advantage in. But the Packers were also built for ball control. And so after a Cleveland punt to start the half, Green Bay methodically marched down the field, starting at their own 10-yard line, okay? And finally, Paul Hornung, the great Paul Hornung, followed Jerry Kramer, the great Jerry Kramer. He followed him into the end zone and scored on a 13-yard Green Bay Packers sweep play. That, with the extra point, gave Green Bay a 20-12 lead with 5 minutes and 42 seconds left in the third quarter. If I'm not mistaken, that was basically one long drive. Like I said, Green Bay allowed Cleveland to drive for a while. Then they forced them to punt. And then starting at their 10, the Packers did all of this damage and ran the clock down to 5:42 in the third when they took that lead. Cleveland drove deep again, but stalled yet again. Now, the unsung hero so far has been the fact that I haven't mentioned how great the Packers defense played other than slowing down Jim Brown. They slowed down a lot of things. So Cleveland drove deep again, but stalled in the third quarter. And here we are back to the toe Groza. Lou Groza's attempt at a field goal, a short field goal, was blocked. So poor Lou Groza, 41-year-old Lou Groza, he's had a PAT bad snap that he had to pick up and try to throw a pass on. That didn't work. And now he has a field goal blocked in a crucial part of the third quarter. So after that, Green Bay still leading 20-12 going into the fourth quarter. So in case you can't tell, I haven't mentioned Jim Brown a whole lot because they did such an excellent job against him that day, at least keeping him out of the end zone. Green Bay in the fourth quarter, they marched down to the Cleveland 22-yard line, and Don Chandler came through for them again. He kicked his third field goal of the game, a short one, from 29 yards, and that gave Green Bay the 23-12 lead that they held on to for the last 9 minutes plus of the game. And so, a game that close, for some reason, they figured out how to slow Jim Brown down enough. You can blame the field. You can blame the defense ganging up on the middle of the field. You can blame a lot of things probably, but the fact is they did a masterful job holding the Cleveland Browns to just 12 points. And so despite all that happened in the fourth quarter, the score never changed again, and Green Bay took this NFL championship game 23-12 without being spoiled by Jim Brown. They got the victory 23-12, and they were champions once again. And yeah, I know the discussion of the scoring from that's kind of boring, and that's because that was football back then in some ways. I mean, this was typical football in 1965. But this game historically doesn't get the attention it deserves, I don't think. And why would that be? It's because the leagues merged and the Super Bowl started, and later you had the Ice Bowl and things like that. And so, the history of this kind of fell behind over all the exciting things that happened after the two leagues merged and the birth of the Super Bowl. So this kind of got lost in the wash, in my opinion. But make no mistake about it, the 1965 NFL championship game played in 1966. It was a bridge. It was the bridge from the old to the new. It was the 9th title for the Packers franchise, going all the way back to the Curly Lambeau days. And more importantly at the time for Lombardi, it proved that Green Bay wasn't done just yet. The dynasty wasn't over after a couple of years of playing in the consolation game. It was the final championship before football became this whole other entity that we know it as now. And for the Browns, it marked the end of their golden era. And Jim Brown would retire just 1 year later at the top of his game, which I don't know all the ins and outs of why Jim Brown retired. I know he had other goals in life other than running around on a football field. I don't know if this game had anything to do with him retiring, but the fact is Green Bay did a heck of a job keeping Jim Brown from dominating them in this NFL title game. And if you're curious about the money back then, I always try to look this up if I can find it. The last NFL championship game, you got to think, well, what did this pay? What was the incentive here? And believe me, when I tell you, I would think in 1965 dollars, this was a ton of incentive, okay? This is back in the days when players still worked part-time in the off-season. I mean, a lot of these players were selling cars, running construction companies, doing the family farm, selling insurance, whatever they had to do because they just didn't make that much money back then. In fact, a fellow from my hometown that I got to know had an opportunity to play on this very Packers team. He had a chance to be a Vince Lombardi coached Green Bay Packer, and he told me the money was terrible, so he signed a Major League Baseball contract instead. That's a true story. So the money wasn't much, so that's why I think what I'm about to tell you was important. The Packers players, for winning this game, each received $7,500. I think that's significant. That should give them a lot of incentive yearly to want to win a title. And the Browns, each player on the Browns received $4,600. So still, in those 1965 dollars, I would think that's really good money. So the MVP of the game was Jim Taylor. And like I said, for Vince Lombardi at least, this set him up even more into sort of the NFL immortality that we know him for. The MVP of the game was Packers fullback Jim Taylor, and he was named the game's most outstanding player by Sport Magazine. I mention Sport Magazine on here all the time because other than Sports Illustrated and the Sporting News, it was what I read as a kid, and it'd been around a long time. So Jim Taylor, for being named the Sport Magazine Most Outstanding Player of the Game, he received a 1966 Chevrolet Corvette. So let me tell you, I'm thinking Jim Taylor had a pretty good year getting $7,500 bonus and a 1966 Corvette. Call me crazy, but that sounds like a pretty good way to end the season to me. All right, let's look at the box score and let's talk about some of the stats involved with this. I think you'll find this interesting. Let me give you a quick rundown one more time of the scoring. Like I told you, Carroll Dale, 47-yard pass from Bart Starr for Green Bay in the first quarter, made it 7-0. Gary Collins, a 17-yard pass from Frank Ryan from Cleveland, made it 7-6 because Lou Groza missed the 24-yard field goal with the bad snap, or missed the PAT with the bad snap. Then Lou Groza came back with a 24-yard field goal, making it 9-7 Cleveland. In the second quarter, Don Chandler scored on a 15-yard field goal, making it 10-9 Green Bay. Don Chandler with a 23-yard field goal made it 13-9 Green Bay. And Lou Groza kicked a 28-yard field goal for Cleveland, making it 13-12 Cleveland at the half. In the second half, third quarter, Paul Hornung scored on a 13-yard rush, 20-12 Green Bay, and then Don Chandler kicked a 29-yard field goal, making the final score 23-12. So, let's see some stats. Green Bay had 21 first downs, talk about ball control offense, and Cleveland was held to 8. Now, I told you that they did a good job on Jim Brown, the Packers did on defense. This is unbelievable to me. Jim Brown, for the game, had 12 carries for 50 yards. His longest run was 15 yards. I would say that is a more than adequate job that they did on Jim Brown. Frank Ryan, now this isn't, let's not start talking trash about Frank Ryan. This was pretty typical for this period of pro football, especially considering the mud. Frank Ryan, he had what we'd now call some high school numbers, but he had 8 completions on 18 attempts for 115 yards. He was intercepted twice and had the 1 touchdown. Bart Starr, really not much better, 10 completions for out of 18 attempts, 147 yards. He had a touchdown. He had an interception. Now, what's interesting to me about the Green Bay offense is I just told you that Jim Taylor was the MVP. And, yeah, he had 27 attempts and 96 yards, but he had no touchdowns. Paul Hornung had 18 carries for 105 yards and a touchdown. So I'm not sure why Chandler, the kicker, or Paul Hornung got looked over. But Jim Taylor, with those 27 carries and 96 yards, he was the MVP and got that Chevrolet Corvette for his efforts. So not a huge statistical game by any stretch. Looks like there were, let's see, how many sacks were in the game? There were 3 sacks on Starr or on Frank Ryan and 3 sacks on Bart Starr. So 3 sacks each. So, just your typical mid 1960s game in the mud and the cold. So nothing outlandish about those numbers, I don't think. But it's really interesting to see that Jim Brown was held like he was and stayed out of the end zone. So anyway, I think that's kind of fascinating if you're a stats person like I am. So what am I saying here? What's the important thing here to remember? Well, it's that the 1965 NFL championship game certainly wasn't flashy, and it didn't need to be because football wasn't flashy necessarily at that point. It was cold. It was physical. The physical aspect of the game was absolutely unforgiving considering the setting and everything, and it represented that great time in pro football or any kind of football when championships were earned in the mud, man, earned in the trenches and playing defense, right? So before the Ice Bowl and before Super Bowls and before the NFL became the multi-billion-dollar industry that it is now, we had this one last NFL championship game, and we had it on color TV for the first ever time, and this was football. Gen X, beginning of the Gen X generation, this was football, 1960s NFL style for sure. So that's the 1965 NFL championship game. And if you enjoyed this little stroll down memory lane, for me, it was more than that because I wasn't born when this happened. So I enjoyed researching this for you. And if you enjoy what we do here, this is closing out our seasonal coverage of football. We'll be back with that in August or so. But for right now, this will be airing the week of the Super Bowl. And then we're going to turn our attention to basketball and other things as we go through the winter and upcoming on the spring. So if you enjoy what we do, please give us a comment. Give us a request. If you want me to cover something you haven't seen on here, hey, shoot, there's a million ways to get in contact with me across all the social medias and all the ways that you can interact with us on YouTube and on Spotify or whatever you listen to us on. Give us a like, give us a comment. Tell people about us who are about our age, Gen Xers, who might really appreciate this stuff. It doesn't have to be Gen Xers. Tell anybody. And I appreciate you spending 30 minutes of your time with me today. And I'll be back with you next week talking about some NCAA basketball. I think we're starting out the basketball coverage with a really good topic. So we'll talk to you in a week. I'm Sean Enos, and this has been GenX Classic Sports.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.